Morning, everybody.
Good morning.
I'm Gayle Feldman, and welcome to Swipe Right for your subject. We're going to be talking about how to find the right subject for you. Many years ago, when I was just starting a biography of Bennett Cerf, the co-founder of Random House, and the man who, more than anybody, made it into a cultural force, and who's quite forgotten today. I went to talk to Jean Strauss, very famous biographer of Alice James and J.P. Morgan, who had spent famously about 14, 15 years on the Morgan and had got a MacArthur Genius Grant afterwards. And I said, what advice do you have for somebody starting out? And she said, I just turned 50.
Right.
And she said, well, you're not going to be writing many biographies in your life. And if you want to do a biography the right way and get it right, you'd better have chosen the right subject. And I never forgot that. And I do not think truer words have ever been spoken. So that's about what I'm going to say. And what I am going to do now is just give you the order of things. I'm going to introduce our three terrific panelists. Then each of them is going to talk for about 5 minutes about how he or she went about choosing one of his or her subjects. And then they're going to talk amongst themselves with a little bit of prodding by me. And then it's going to be question time. And I hope that you will put into the chat box, while all of this talk is going on, your own questions. At the very end of the hour, if you want to talk some more, we will stay until 12:15, when some of us have got to do roundtables. And you will be able to ask more questions. So, our three panelists. Eric Washington wrote his second book, Boss of the Grips, on Red Cat James H. Williams, who was the chief porter at Grand Central Station in New York in the glory days when there really was a red carpet to get you on to the 20th Century Limited. And he has combined Harlem history and railroad history to make a fascinating book. And he's working on his second book now, which is about a Black Broadway actor who was a contemporary of Williams. Mary Dearborn, Dr. Mary Dearborn, has written 7 biographies. She started as a baby, and her subjects have ranged from Louise Bryant and Henry Miller and Peggy Guggenheim to Ernest Hemingway. She is the first woman to have tackled a cradle-to-grave Hemingway biography. And if I am correct, she has just finished a biography of Carson McCullers. Gerry Howard. Gerry Howard is writing his first biography of famous editor and critic Malcolm Cowley. But Gerry Howard is doing this in his, quote, retirement, because he's just retired from 42 years of editing. books of all sorts, very distinguished books of all sorts, including biographies by Bio's very own Debbie Applegate, Amanda Vale, Carl Rollison, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And whereas Mary might talk a bit about gender and how that goes into choosing a subject, or famous or not famous, and Eric may talk a bit about resurrecting unknown figures who were well known in their day. Jerry will talk about Cowley, but also about how publishers see biography and what might get them to whip out the checkbook, or what might get them to not. Eric, let's get going.
I can talk a little bit about how I came to writing this. I don't know if I think he sort of discovered me in a way. I was giving tours of, I was asked to give tours of Grand Central for the centennial in 2013. And at first I was inclined to decline because it's not really my beat. I kind of focus more on Upper Manhattan and Harlem area. But I was curious and I wanted to write something about Grand Central, not about the architecture, because everyone would be writing about that. And so I thought, well, I know there's a long history of African Americans in the railroad. I knew about sleeping car porters. I think I'd heard of red caps and just kind of thought they were the same thing. I didn't know that I would hit pay dirt, because it took me a second to learn that Grand Central was the Central Park of railroad stations. Whatever happened there, every other railroad station across the country would be sort of trying to emulate it. And so this fellow, James Williams, who integrated what had been an all-white workforce in 1903 and then became the chief of that force 6 years later in 1909, became this really interesting figure because he had the power to hire, train, fire a number of people. And then the number of people who he associated with who traveled, who were the Astors and the Roosevelts and anybody black and white who was traveling by rail, who he cultivated relationships with, some more profound than others. But then it was a whole other host of sort of his work family that passed through, whether they were working there for a holiday week or a summer, or while they were paying for school. And this is one of the things that he became famous for, which I learned in the process of learning more about him, was that he expressly, not exclusively, but expressly hired a lot of young Black college men so that they could stay in school. And anybody who's been in college has probably had a job, waiting tables or delivering pizza or whatever. And African-American college men were no exception, but they had exceptions to what options were available to them. And Williams hired them. And a lot of them became people whose names would certainly survive his own in familiarity, like Paul Robeson, Adam Clayton Powell Jr., clerics, judges, linguists, people in every discipline that one can imagine in the living world. So I latched on to this person because I had, I'm not into railroads particularly, other than, watching movies like, North by Northwest 1,000 times, which I now see differently. But I worked in restaurants for a good long time in my career while I was writing as a freelancer. And I think I identified a lot with this figure because it's the hospitality industry. It's a branch of tourism, as our restaurants. There's a cadre of people who, in any kind of work community that is vast, and we're talking about him overseeing anywhere from several dozen to up to like 500 people. You will have these little pockets of communities within that work community, which is very much like what I was familiar with in working in one of the largest restaurants in the country. So I found a bond with this figure. I thought I didn't have a real idea when I approached him how long I might be working on be living with him. But I certainly felt a bond where I thought he's, not a bad roommate for a while, for however long it will be. And I would say it took, all told, it was about 5 or 6 years from beginning the research that started with a little article and then developing into what was a published book.
Mary.
Hi, I've thought of a number of things just listening to you, Eric, and you, Gayle. I'll talk a bit about Hemingway. My last 2 book choices, which were Hemingway and the one that I've just finished about Carson McCullers. And first I want to say is, Gayle, you said that Gene Strauss said it was the most important decision was the subject. And I would concur and say it's the most fraught and miserable making. I've never gone through such, it's a soul searching, research, all this stuff. It's always only in the case of Carson McCullers was it pleasant. But as far as Hemingway goes, I feel like I was kind of locked into writing about him because I had written what turned out to be 2 biographies of very much men known for defining masculinity in the last century. That is Henry Miller and Norman Mailer. And I understood that I would have to address Ernest Hemingway. So I knew that was coming. And my decision to do it was, and I find this has been true too, is answering my own internal objections to the subject, or, the little voice that's playing devil's advocate in my head, or my imagined editor in my head saying, no way, that'll sell, 2 books. Or, and in the case of Hemingway, they were, I'd say predominantly the one that it was the one that I was most asked, which is there something new I should know about? And that's really tough because a lot of times, unless we're really, really blessed, there is like no huge cache of material or an estate, the difficult estate that died or disappeared. Usually it's you have decided to do it, or you think that the world is ready for another one. And number 2 is why aren't there enough Hemingway biographies already? And my answer to that was always yes, except for mine. And you have to feel that you're doing something new, or else it's not going to communicate. You have to have that sort of passion that you'll be saying something new. A lot of times for me, it was looking at material in new ways, and I didn't quite know how to explain that. So that to give one example, when I started this, I was going to write about the Hemingway family, itself an interesting, difficult decision, one I abandoned. And I was at the Harry Ransom Center in Texas, looking at their Hemingway material with mostly his mother's papers. Hemingway had this extraordinary mother, very difficult, very, very, very much larger than life as he was. And I'm looking at these things and I'm saying, boy, there've been a lot of Hemingway biographies, but these biographers haven't looked at these papers. I was seeing stuff in them that was completely new. And I was getting kind of, identifying with his mother, like, look at me, aren't I, and it struck me then, that's when it struck me that the previous biographers had all been men. And I really do think there was a kind of belittling of the importance of Grace Hemingway, that, it's the mother's papers. Yeah, I have to go see them. But if you go to them saying, oh, let's see what she has to say, let's see what made Hemingway, it's a whole different thing. So, and that sort of fed into the supposed claim that I'm the first woman to have written a biography of Hemingway, which is kind of true, largely true. But I just very briefly, I did feel that was something new, and that I was writing a lot about the Hemingway myth and trying to dispel it. And in other words, this macho hero, you all know the drill. But I wanted to look at how that worked and how it damaged Hemingway. And it struck me that maybe a woman was the only one who was not going to be, at all seduced by the myth. Because I feel like every biographer is. So that's pretty much Hemingway. So.
Mm-hmm. Very.
So this is my first rodeo, and unless some insanity grabs me farther down, it will be my last. My interest in Malcolm Cowley dates from 1973, when I was just out of college and I was reading a lot of American literature for a variety of reasons. And I came upon a review by William Styron of a book by this man I'd never heard of, Malcolm Cowley, called A Second Flowering, Works and Days of the Lost Generation. And there were these beautiful, personal, deeply intimate portrayals of his generation. He is of the lost generation, had many of the same experiences of Hemingway, Fitzgerald Cummings, Thomas Wolfe, Thornton Wilder, et cetera, et cetera. And this had acquainted me with something, the fact that my 4 years at college hadn't, which were writers were actually people. This hit me with the force of revelation. And I went on to read Cowley's classic and first account of the lost generation, Exile's Return. And then the gods were very, very kind. They found me an editorial job at Viking Penguin, and I got to meet Malcolm Cowley, which, as I have said, was approximately the same. I had just about the same feelings that Billy Crystal had when he met Mickey Mantle, awe, just total awe. And I met him a number of times, 3-4 times. I kind of sort of became his last editor. But I'm a book editor. I've done a lot of biographies, and I was always on the lookout for somebody to do a biography of Malcolm Cowley in the same spirit that A. Scott Berg had done Max Perkins, to bring somebody who is more of a player in the background to the foreground, and to show how people like that influence what we read and how we value the things that we read. And I never found that person. And then there is a very good scholar, Hans Bach, who's, it tells you something that he's a Dutch scholar of American studies, who has done one book on Cowley and who edited a massive collection of Malcolm's letters and called The Long Voyage, which I reviewed for Book Forum. And it got me to thinking. I mean, collection of letters is good, but a biography would be better. And then I was going to work. It was maybe 7:48 on a spur of the New Jersey Turnpike in a Coach USA bus, when the fatal idea hit me that I should do it. And now I am doing it. And on the one hand, and writing a biography is really hard, folks. If you don't know that yet, I'm here to tell you, it's a lot harder than editing one. I will testify to it, but I'm enjoying it very much, to the extent that anybody can ever enjoy writing. I don't know why people do it. It's just such a miserable thing. But anyway, it's a good thing too, because I got a career out of it. So in terms of choosing a subject, I'm not much help. He chose me. It was a series of circumstances over 45 years that led me to do this, no escape. In terms of looking at a biography from a publisher's point of view, you know, I actually jotted down around 10 or 12 considerations that you might that would have to go into the choice of choosing a subject. And I believe you could literally work these up into an algorithm, you know, the biographical choice algorithm, where you could weight these things and you could put in the data, and it would be like, in fact, I think it would be exactly like sentencing guidelines, you know?
Like that list that we talked about in our earlier conversation.
The way they do it. And it might be helpful, but it all comes down to the bottom consideration: how badly do you want to or need to do this? And that informs everything else. And I think any publisher, whether at a university press or a trade publisher, wants to be convinced, wants to feel the passion in the proposal, wants to feel that even if the subject is unlikely, that there's passion behind it, there's a person of consequence to be met, and some cultural news to bring to the world, however many people you want to define the world as. And I can go into that subject in greater detail later.
I think that what everybody has said in one way or another is that it was the passion or the sense of mission, you know, resurrecting somebody who had a consequential life, whose life mattered, who did something, and whose life, you know, speaks to you, and that you're curious about. You're curious about the connections that that life can illuminate in that person's world, and from that person's world to today's world. I think that's something that all of you have talked about, and I think that is the essential thing. I'm sure there are some people who do biographies, you know, purely for the money, but
in England, they do it in England.
In England, but I can't imagine. I know it wouldn't sustain me. I mean, I've been working on Cerf for a long time because there was never a biography of him, and his life covered an enormous surface, and there had to be something else that motivated it. But the practical matters do come into it. So would each of you, you know, like to talk just a little bit about how the practical considerations, you know, how long can you work on this thing? You know, how much money do you have in terms of an advance or anything else to keep you going on it? Because that might determine, is it going to be a cradle to grave? Is it going to be a slice of life? Is it going to be 100 views of? Talk a little bit about those other considerations.
I think I was fortunate because I was very naive. I've written a lot of profiles and some celebrity profiles, but never a book-length biography. And I think I was just pretty naive about what it would take and what those kind of considerations to make. And I was blessed for having a family member who had become the repository of a lot of the photos of my subject. And he had given me his carte blanche blessing to use, you know, whatever information he had and whatever materials he had. but I thought this will be a breeze. And because he's not so famous, this subject, what what can there be? And I had no money. And so I had the passion and the mission. And then I think I was fortunate to get a Leon Levy fellowship. And as I was paying my rent and eating at the same time, I realized there's a lot, and which enabled me to do a lot of the research. There is a lot more there than I had imagined, and I could see how naive I was. So in a certain way, I'm glad I didn't know the caveats, because I just kind of went in gung ho. But I'm also glad that this boon fell into my lap of the fellowship that allowed me to kind of pursue, going to the archives and doing the work and taking the extra bit of time that this subject merited. So I don't know. I think there are there's a litany of things that one should consider, like, how much of this life of your life is this person's life going to take? Can you afford to do this? What archives are there? What primary sources are there? What materials? Where are they? Are they immediate? Do you have to travel to them? Will there be, opposition from the family? All of those things are worth considering. But in a certain sense, I'm glad I was too naive to really know all of that stuff, because I think I might have been dissuaded, and then he wouldn't have been written about. And I think that would have been too bad, because now I've been able to introduce him to a lot of people who keep wanting to asking me more about him and are really interested, and are interested in the people who he was interested in and who he knew. So it wasn't just his world was indeed that. It was populated by, so many different types, many of whom were, are recognizable figures, and some are just figures that you want to say, oh my God, how come I don't know about them? That this person was so instrumental or just so interesting. So,
Mary?
I don't know. We talked about this before, and I thought, when we're getting such laughable, minuscule advances, I don't know that you can't be practical about this, or to put it another way, you can, don't expect a thing, and find some other way to support yourself. That is, I remember, wasn't there something, I believe it was the 90s, maybe it was the 80s too, that was like the golden age of book advances. And then Jerry, maybe I'm wrong, then they just, or mine did anyway, maybe it's I think
it's complicated.
Yeah, but it used to be different, and we used to not have to worry about this. Now, I don't know. I think I make my decisions in spite of practicalities, than because of them. But one thing you said, Eric, and then I'll let Jerry tell us about those advances, is that you mentioned the estate, and I don't want to go on about it now, but that's a very practical matter that you really have to be serious about, and see if there's going to be opposition, or if they want you to do it, why do they want you to do it? Most importantly, will they demand to look at the manuscript, and how, if they don't, how much opposition will you get? And that's a really important consideration.
Well, I'm not here to defend publishing, which is probably indefensible, but and it's certainly irrational, which is part of the tensions within the business that which has turned corporate, which is corporations like things to be rational, and publishing is not. And one of the markers of publishing's irrationality is that we continue to publish biographies, which, with the exception of certain exceptions, are not big bottom line contributors. Okay, a biography of Ron Chernow could disagree, of course. I mean, and people who write biographies of big megastars, and might disagree, and Kitty Kelly would disagree. But in general, their contributions are to our bottom line are modest, and yet on the irrational side, it just seems necessary to keep on doing them because they're interesting in the first place. Some of them are very, very fine. They bring to the surface the stories of how our culture was made. They're important in the larger cultural picture, and that's why I published a couple of dozen of them. The other reason that publishers like to publish biographies is that they get reviewed. They're review bait. And it kind of makes you feel like you're doing something useful to pick up the New York Times or the Washington Post or the New York Review of Books and see a book that you've published being reviewed intelligently, and one hopes favorably. So I would say to any biographer who's not Ron Chernow, look for other sources of support and income. Marry well. That's always a good strategy. Look to maybe be a professor and make that writing of that biography be part of your job. That's helpful. And of course, there are many places that offer grants and residencies that do that. I'm lucky myself because I've managed to retire with a decent amount of money in the bank, and so I don't have to depend on my advance, which was very nice, frankly. Thank you, Scott Moyers as Penguin. If you can arrange to have Scott Moyers at Penguin as your editor, do so. And if you can arrange to have Eric Simonoff as your agent, do so, because these are two wonderful people, and I feel total support from them.
Right. Yeah. Right. Yeah. I mean,
and by the way, I really should say that's part a joke and part not. Your agent is a very, very good resource in all of these decisions. Listen, A, get an agent, and B, listen to him or her. And I'm sure Mary and Eric would agree to that. Yeah.
And get an agent for the long haul. I mean, Eric Simonoff is also my agent. He is Amanda Vale's agent. He is Stacey Schiff's agent. But there are lots of agents out there who are good at doing biography. But an agent who is good at doing biography, at working with authors of biography, is an agent in it for the long haul.
Yeah.
Because eventually, except in the case of Mary, who's ruining the curve for the rest of us, your agent is going to have to ask your publisher for an extension.
Indeed, or for many extensions, which has been my case.
You know, conversely, what Jerry was saying, I think we are tremendously lucky that there's a market of publishers or of editors for what we do. I mean, it's amazing that we have those built-in readers and that people will take a chance that they'll get more readers with the books their authors do. So I don't want to, I mean, especially when one wants to do literary biographies. I mean, these editors are very open to literary subjects. And anyways, I don't mean to at all to denigrate the publishing industry.
Let me do that. I know more about it than you do.
I was just going to add that I think the agent that I wanted, I got, and she was also instrumental in making me feel that I had swiped correctly. I had swiped right in choosing my subject. And I think her enthusiasm and guidance, and I don't have a lot of experience with agents. I knew I wanted her to see it, and she was interested, so I can't say what others are like, but I was immediately, I don't know that all agents read. Some are good at marketing and not as good at reading, I think, vice versa, or both. But I was excited that she really read the material, and she read lots of material, and she knew the genre, and she had other writers writing in the genre. And coincidentally, she had a client who was who was the son of my subject, which I, not her client, but who had written a book, was finishing a book about firemen in New York City, and he figured prominently. Manhattan's first black fireman was the son of my subject. So when she had me do my spiel for her, she said, "Well, I have a Williams connection too." So I knew it was the right person, and that was just another thing that sort of added to my knowing that, oh, this subject is somebody I think it will be worthwhile moving in with.
There are a couple of other things that we talked about in advance. For instance, what happens if you fall out of love with your subject, or how, should you be in love with your subject? How do you sustain living with your subject? That's one area. And that I'd like you to speak briefly about. And another is the kind of research that you need to do at the very beginning in terms of making sure that, are other people working on the same subject, or have there been books that are very similar to what I want to do, and is this going to work out? Could you talk very briefly about those matters, and to throw one more in, better dead than alive. We've got about 7 minutes or 8 minutes before I should open it up to people's questions. So pick and choose what you'd like to talk about from among the topics.
I don't know whether that many of us admit to coming to despise our subjects, or if any of us do, but just having written a biography of Norman Mailer, I thought maybe I could speak to this, but no, just briefly, it happens. I thought Norman Mailer was the greatest thing since sliced bread. I thought The White Negro was absolutely revolutionary. Anyway, and I fell out of love, but it in my experience, which is usually that, it's less extreme. You think they've made some bad decisions or whatever, but that it does work itself out in the end. It was good training for working on Hemingway.
I neither fell in love. I mean, I was always intrigued by my subject. I don't think I fell in love with him, but I found I had a sense of commonality. I think, like myself, he was shy, not pathologically shy. He did his work. He was commanding. He commanded, this small army of workers. But he wasn't a man of letters. He didn't speak. He was interviewed a lot. He often said pretty much the same thing, to the press if he was being interviewed. So he was articulate, but he wasn't charismatic. But I was intrigued by the deference that was paid to him. I was nervous, though, that the family member, the great-grandson, who I mentioned, had written a book about his grandfather, my subject's son. And I didn't know about that until I was already gung-ho to do this. And then I thought, oh my gosh, does he want to write? Is he writing the family history? And he assured me right off, I think he anticipated, he said, I'm not planning to write a book about my great-grandfather. You have my blessing. So that took me off the hook there. And he didn't make any demands or even ask to read the material, any of the material. So I had the blessing of having his blessing without any hooks attached to it. I don't know if that directly answered your question, Gayle, but
Yeah, no. Jerry?
So in respect to liking my subject, I don't think there's anything that I have found that has dimmed my esteem and my deep liking for Malcolm Cowley. But I would say that I'm working now on the chapter on the 1930s, and the issue that I'm wrestling with is that, you know, he was as they say, a fellow traveler and a Stalinist sympathizer for complicated reasons. And I believe there's a certain amount of political idiocy in his behavior in the 30s. And he wasn't alone in that. And I am trying to talk about the mistakes that he made, and which he recognized later on in a way that is frank but sympathetic, because I don't want to become a Malcolm Cowley scold, but I do have to hold up the political mistakes that he made to the light of day. In respect to competition, well, there wasn't any, but apparently Hans Bach, who did, as I mentioned, did the selected letters, is working on a full soup to nuts academic biography of Malcolm Cowley, which he deserves. That is not the book I am writing. I am writing a book for that mythical beast, the general reader, and it is anecdotal. I mean episodic, in the sense that there's going to be a lot of Cowley's life that I'm just going to move past. And my aim in the book is twofold: to get more people to know who Malcolm Cowley is and why he matters. And secondly, to show how American literature was formed through his life and what his role in forming our sense of American literature is. And I think, and that's a different aim than I believe what Professor Bach is doing.
Yes, I think that it's essential that you are clear about what you're trying to do in a biography, the purpose of the book, because there can be so many stories, especially if the person had a big life. There can be so many intersections. You can be tempted, you know, research can be fascinating, wonderful, enjoyable, interviewing can be, and you want to use all this terrific stuff you've got, but there may not be room for you to use all that terrific stuff. The reader may not want to know all that terrific stuff. What the reader wants is a story of a life, and some other story through that life about an editor and literature and what he did, what an editor does, about all of the connections that you know you found, Eric, but you can't do everything. You have to. I think that's a lesson that I've had to learn. You have to know your limits, and that it is, after all, a biography. Which brings us. Oh, Eric.
No, the thing I wanted to do was focus on my subject's contribution to the work he was doing, but I expressly did not want to celebrate the job. It was a Jim Crow job. It was mm-hmm. I was more interested in how he himself and how he inspired the work to kind of, there's an African-American expression, to make a way out of no way. This is what we're relegated to in this department, and we'll make it work for us because we've got to. And that interested me in exploring and celebrating that sense of their own sense of mission and purpose, much more so than celebrating, the grunt work that they were obliged to do.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes. I mean, Bennett Cerf knew everybody who was anybody during his lifetime. Everybody in America knew him. But why does he matter? I mean, he's been forgotten about, but he matters because he made Random House and because he connected, books and Broadway and TV and Hollywood in a way that nobody had before. So let's turn to the questions, many of which are very good, and we've got quite a few. Somebody has asked, do you include the story of your passion in the actual biography, in the first person, or how you establish your voice? I mean, part of that is, are you in the biography? Who'd like to tackle that? Jerry?
No, I wasn't. Except maybe my implied voice in the introduction, but no.
Me, just briefly too, is I tried with my introduction to Carson McCullers and it failed miserably. So I don't think I can do it. I don't think I'm capable of it. Don't write that kind of book.
Jared?
Yes, I will begin with how I got onto Malcolm Kelly. Because I think it's important. I think it's a good launching pad for me. Okay, and I think I actually will need to convince readers that they should go, that there's something they should go on for. And so I'm trying to communicate my passion. And toward the end, I was lucky to have been at Malcolm's 90th birthday party up in Sherman, Connecticut, which is a scene. And I was at his memorial service at the Century Club. And these are very useful things for me. So I will, to that extent, I will be there, but for the most part, I will not.
Mm-hmm. Elisa George has asked Mary, but I think you could all weigh in. How much did you emphasize the faults that you discovered about your subjects? Did you lean in fully? How did you find a balance between what the learned traits you disliked?
I'm trying to be diplomatic. I didn't realize Henry Miller's faults until about 10 years later. Norman Mailer, though, I think because I did start off just admiring him so much, and then you strike a balance and you become more alert to subtler things and that I think are more important finally about your subject. In that sense, it can be good, like that Mailer was eternally curious, that he had his finger on the pulse, as they say, and so forth. But Hemingway's the character where it's caused not because of negative things about him, though there sure are those, more his faults, his failings, his how was I going to convey those and not have it, and yet not have it be a negative biography, something that I'm where I'm just cutting them down. And I think the real challenge, and it came very naturally, was a kind of compassion or protectiveness of him set in with me, and I just couldn't stand to see him instinctively people denounced or whatever. I just, especially because of his failings and his faults and the things I found wrong with him, I felt I needed to protect him. I think that works out okay.
Mhm.
It's real complicated, isn't it?
It sure is. Amanda Vale has a question. Some biographers want to have access to their subjects' archives or permission from their subjects or their estates to write a biography. Other biographers feel this kind of sanctioned access compromises their ability to be objective and prefer to write unauthorized biographies. How do you feel about this? How would access or renunciation of it influence your choice of a subject?
My subject didn't really have archives other than I mentioned this great grandson who had become the repository of all of these photos and things like that, and had written about his grandfather. So I thought he might be a bit possessive, and he wasn't. But I knew that now this exists. He's got boxes and reams of whatever of photos, and I'd like to get my hands on them. So I was obliged to ask, but I held my breath because I didn't know if there would be a catch. And I was lucky there wasn't. I was concerned there's one descendant who was alive when my subject died. She would have been 8. And she wouldn't, of course I wanted to speak to her, and she wouldn't speak to me. She wasn't hostile, but she just wouldn't return so all along, I never knew if I would have to anticipate some sort of, opposition, in the background, and that didn't happen. But I certainly, I was aware that could be a problem if, I wanted to have access to what archives there were, and then, there was going to be a catch to it. Like, well, yes, you can have this in exchange for, showing me your manuscript or whatever. And that didn't, I was lucky that didn't happen,
So in my particular case, Callie's archives are quite a lot of them are at the Newberry Library, beautifully cataloged, and it is a much traveled archive among scholars of American literary history. And I do have the blessing of Malcolm's son, Rob Calley, to do this book. So that's not an issue. Speaking as a former editor, I mean, I tended to prefer to have biographies, sign them up without problems in the beginning, and unauthorized can translate into problems down the line. I mean, it would really depend on whether the headaches were worth it. I was very interested in signing up a biography of Edward Gorey by Mark Derry. I really wanted to do that book because the proposal was very good, and I was interested in Gorey, and that did not have the blessings of the Gorey estate, but it seemed surmountable, and it was. The book came out, it was very good. A less happy story would be the biography of Susan Sontag by Carl Rollison that I signed up for Norton. That was flagrantly unauthorized, and it was really a horror show. I don't even want to talk about it. It was so difficult. There was so much opposition to that book.
Yeah. Mary?
Amanda and I have this argument a lot, but I really can't. I could only write an unauthorized biography. I just feel I would be too constrained. I don't think I'm diplomatic enough. I mean, if there's an estate who's, looking over your shoulder, it would be hard for me to function. Not that I'm, but and then it comes up other times, and like if I'm there, well, with a living figure, it's going to come up a lot. But people I've interviewed, any interview out there is just going to, their hair's going to turn white. But in the case of a male or wife and a male or girlfriend, agreed that they could look at what I was writing about them. I was so bending over backward, and that's very bad policy. And it didn't work well. And I'm afraid that I do that with an estate who was authorizing what I was doing. With Hemingway, I tried to, there's an estate that wants royalties, and I just tried to fly under the radar and not deal with the estate, and sometimes that works.
Beverly Gray has asked a question that is related to this. How do you figure out if there's an estate that might intrude on your project? She says that her subject was a gay man who died in 1985. His longtime partner died, and there's no close family still alive. Hundreds of boxes of papers are in local universities. They're not restricted, but where do you look to find out if there are unforeseen issues?
Tend to find out.
Yeah.
Well, sometimes the editor is the one who brings this up too, and you have to go and find out. And it's hard. There's not like some address that all, these estates are. It's hard to find out. Sometimes you hear it at the archives, and sometimes you can,
Probate court. That's somebody, you got to go through the settling of the estate. Probably maybe have to hire a lawyer or a legal, a paralegal to find that out for you. Do the search.
Had to. It's sort of one of these other biographers often know, or, say, oh, isn't there a problem with his son? And, you find out, and you will inevitably find out.
And I think that the librarians at major archives, they are really helpful, really smart people. And they remember the people who, come in and who are doing research and the stories that those people tell them. And they often provide useful information.
My first family contact happened to be the right person, and he was there was no official estate. There was a collection of papers for Wesley Williams, my subject's son, at the Schomburg, and so he was the sign-off person to give permission to use some of the images that had been donated to the Schomburg, but I otherwise didn't run into that problem. So I was lucky to find the one person who kind of spoke for.
Right.
Whether the aunt who did speak to me or not, but she was actually, I should say that she was gung-ho once the book came out.
Well, I see that it is going to be high noon in 1 minute, and probably the bells in the church down the street from me are going to toll. So although they're going to toll, we can have the post-panel session. If anybody would like to ask more questions for another 15 minutes. And Steve Paul has said, use the raise the hand icon. And he will be controlling that. So I must thank our wonderful panelists. You've done a terrific job, truly. And I hope it will give some people a bit more courage to get on with it. Choose your subject and just do it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Gayle. I'll just thank you all. I will just jump in and say we have one hand raiser right now, and I'll go ahead and kind of allow those people as they arise to speak. So Ed Sullivan has joined us.
Wow, loved your show.
Yeah.
Really good show.
Really good.
Sorry,
Oh.
We've heard that joke so many times. I apologize.
Ed, you are on. And you are unmuted, so I'm not sure why. If not, I will move on to Vincent, and we'll come back to Ed if he comes back.
Yes, hi. I'm interested in seeing Mr. Howard's 12-point list. I would wonder if that's available. And then to Eric and to all of you, there's a lot of reasons not to go in a certain direction. How do you avoid talking yourself out of a good idea? An article's enough. Nobody really would want to be reading this. I find that it's easy to do that. How do you not do that?
Everybody take a screenshot. Yeah.
Take a
Here,
screenshot.
what I'm going to do for you is I'm going to read it like they put all the boilerplate at the end of pharmaceutical ads. So to do, done already, how often and by whom, done adequately or for all time, stature and interest of subject, timeliness, anniversaries, new trends, etc., sources, new, lack of, size of potential audience, trade or university press, is subject alive, willing, the estate, on board or against, finances needed, time needed, grants, residencies, etc. Finally, how badly do you want to do or need this?
I got 8 of them. Thank you.
I part of what convinced me that it was worth doing was just that I think it wasn't just, even if my subject was which sort of interesting, but no greater, but he was surrounded by all of these people who I felt sure that my audience, my readership, if they were going to emerge, would be would feel satisfied with knowing, would thrill to being introduced to meeting and just a lot of the anecdotal and episodic things that were contained in this rarefied world that was not just about Grand Central, but that made this world, this Midtown world, an extension of Harlem, this iconic neighborhood. So that was one of the things that helped me pare it down. It was just kind of like, oh, they're going to love this, they'll love it not. They're going to love this, they'll love it not. It ended up with they're going to love.
Thank you.
Steve, you're.
Sorry, yeah, okay. We're ready to move on. Ed Sullivan is now back and ready to go. Oh, well,
maybe not.
Ed,
we
you
can't
are.
hear him.
Yeah, unfortunately, Ed, you are still muted. Even though you look unmuted, you are still muted. You might have a problem with your microphone. Yes, he says his microphone is not working. So,
Can he write it in the chat box?
Yeah, go ahead and add your question to the chat box. We'll get to it that way.
And we had a couple of other questions in the chat box from Hitchcock. I can't see the full name. The widow of my subject has given me written permission and access, but if she dies and the surviving daughter objects, ? What happens? I think you need to find a very good publishing lawyer if that happens. And there are some.
Some just that's not directly to the subject, but a lot of the times when we work on these things, you're totally afraid of one thing. This is going to happen. When I publish it, that one's going to object. And what I can say from much experience is you will get attacked, but it's never from the quarter that you fear. So often what we fear most in something like an angry widow or is not the quarter at all that we receive it from. Meryl Seacrest wrote a great book that about biography called Shoot the Widow. It's what you do first.
Yes.
So in chat, I see the question from Mr. Sullivan. What steps do you recommend in trying to secure an agent? I can take a shot at that. Broadly, try to be somebody who is of interest to agents, to establish yourself in a variety of ways, basically by writing good things in the right places, to so that when you approach an agent, you are not just somebody with an idea, even a good one, or for a biography, but you're the person who has written for this publication, that publication, the other publication, maybe written a book or two or something like that. You need to build a resume before you approach an agent. You sort of have to be the kind of person they're looking for. You have to shape yourself in that direction.
I had a different experience with my agent. I had met her several years before on a coat check line.
And they're only that way, yeah.
Right.
And by the way, I should say, or have your agent have been your assistant 30 years ago, which is how I got Eric Simonoff. You could try that. That's helpful.
My problem was just I didn't know how to contact her. She had sent me a book of one of her clients that she saw me ogling at this affair, and with a little note on it, but the note very conveniently didn't have any contact information, just her name. But I thought, she's the one I want to see it. So I managed, when I was ready to make a proposal, I wanted her to see it first, and I went through another writer who's a bio member and said, "You're friends with Faith, can you just ask her, if she'd be willing?" Within 60 seconds, she said, "Have him call me." So for me, it was fairly triangular, but directly, it was rapid.
Just for
But I don't think
briefly,
it's typical,
look at their client list. It really does make a difference. And also you can do that famous, and then your flattery works better because you can say, "I see you did this book," but it's really a good way.
And the writing sample, really put whatever you can, all of the best that you can, into the writing sample, because that can really convince.
Yeah, I would say, editors and agents, they look at the world in the same way, and we're in a lot of the same ways, I should say. And we're just sitting there reading just tons and tons of stuff all day long. And what you're waiting for is that moment. You want to pick up something and look at it and say, "Wow, that's really good," or like, I didn't know that, or "Boy, I want to know more about this." You want that thing that will just wake you up from your it's not a stupor, but the general run of daily experience, to seize you, grab your attention, so, and that's, I'm just amplifying what Gayle is saying, that first encounter that you're offering somebody on the page with what you have to say is really the most important thing. And the other thing I want to say, just I want to shout out to my panelists here, that Eric, your book about the red cap is such an interesting project. I would have done it in a second if it had been submitted to me, because it just makes such sense to me. And Mary, I'm really interested in your Carson McCullers book. I think the time is right for a fresh look at her, and she's offbeat enough to be fresh, but she's part of what was going on in the 50s. And Gayle, as a publishing geek, how interested I am in your Pen and Surf book. Yeah.
But I will say, further to what you just said, my first book, which was published by Gerald Howard, I didn't have an agent. It was my first book. And I did this proposal, And since I was working at Publishers Weekly, I had a kind of profile in the trade, and I sent it to a couple of different agents whom I'd heard good things about. And I phoned them beforehand. And one of them, she said, you know, it's a cancer memoir. I don't know if I'm, I don't know if this is, I get so many book proposals sent to me, but I'll look at it, send it. And the following week, I was quite surprised. Within a few days, I got a call from this woman whom I'd never met. And she said, I'm going to take this on. And it was, she hadn't been, she really didn't know. We'd never met. She hadn't been that interested. In fact, she'd said she probably wasn't interested. And it was just, the proposal spoke to her. And I think that is the case so very often. So don't despair, if you really want to do it, you do it. And somebody will respond.
I'm really, when I wrote about Henry Miller, that was my first commercial book, really. And my agent had me working on that proposal for 9 months. She kept sending me back to it and back to it. And she was absolutely right. And other reasons to do that are that it does double duty. You can use it for your grant applications. I would make short 3-page versions for those. And then it does double duty again when you have to give talks, and you've already got it there. And then most of mine wind up as the introduction to my book of some sort. So it's a really important piece of writing, probably the most. And it's where you work out too, whether you want to do this.
And what you're doing.
Yes, yeah, what it's all
where
about.
You figure out, this is the book I'm going to write.
Yeah, it's pretty key.
Yeah.
Steve Paul. Oh, that's kind of interesting, Steve.
Yes. Yes. Yes, you can indeed place books without an agent, because sometimes agents do get it wrong, or you don't get to the right agent. That too, my goodness. In writing about Bennett Cerf and Random House, there were a number of times, even, those many years ago, where there were books that became famous and, were celebrated or made the bestseller list that had been rejected by agent after agent after agent, publisher after publisher after publisher. But in the end, they made it.
Mm-hmm.
Norman Maclean's A River Runs Through It was turned down by every house in town.
Mm-hmm.
And then it was picked up by he was a professor at the University of Chicago, and the University of Chicago Press published it. And I have a good, one of my favorite publishing stories was that during this time, it had been turned down by an editor at Alfred A. Knopf. But while the book was heading to the University of Chicago Press, another editor at the Knopf contacted Norman Maclean and saying, "We're here. We've heard about this book, and perhaps we might be interested." And Norman Maclean was Scottish in every possible sense of the word Scottish. He held a grudge, and he said, "Dear Mr. Editor, if Alfred A. Knopf were the last publisher in the universe and I were the last writer, that would be the end of the printed word." Oh, and the previous editor, by the way, had said, well, this book has too many trees in it. That letter is in the Harry Ransom Center if you want to look for it.
Really?
On that happy note, Eric, you've got a round table to go to.
Yes, yes. Thank you, everyone.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
that was
Yeah,
fun.
thanks for
Thank
the
you,
questions.
panelists. It's really
guys.
been a great experience making your acquaintance and doing
This
this.
as well. Hope to see you
Thank
all
you.
in the near future in live.
Yes, in real life, and
Yeah.
good luck to all.
Okay, thanks, everyone.
See you
God
all around.
knows
Bye,
we need it.
everyone. I'm checking out.
Bye.
Bye.